David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
There is a just blockbuster, bombshell, new story that we must talk about. And I want to kind of set this up for you by telling you what this is not about. We have Trump-Russia going on with a special prosecutor, Robert Mueller. Put that aside for now. We have this abortive attempted confirmation of Donald Trump's Supreme Court pick, Brett Kavanaugh, an alleged serial sex assaulter. This is not that story. We have, which we'll talk about a little bit later on in the program, this not really new trade deal called the USMCA. Put that aside for now. Put basically every scandal and every failed promise aside that we have seen from and by the Trump administration for now, because we have something totally new that's going on. This is a new state tax investigation that has started as a result of massive, massive allegations of fraud against Donald Trump and his family in a just extraordinarily detailed and thoroughly researched New York Times special investigation. So here's what's going on. New York Times yesterday has published, to call it lengthy is an understatement, to call it extensive is an understatement, investigation, which exposes that Trump and his family have committed, quote, instances of outright fraud. That is a direct phrase from the investigation meant to transfer millions upon millions of dollars from Trump's father, Fred Trump, to his kids without paying the taxes that one is supposed to pay. In addition to just the claims made by the New York Times, New York State tax officials have said, we are now looking into this. There is a confirmed state level tax investigation into what the allegations are from the New York Times. Yet another one of Donald Trump's lawyers, this is one I hadn't previously heard of, his name is Charles Harder. Apparently that's his real name. He obviously denied that Donald Trump has done anything wrong, has committed any fraud, no wrongdoing whatsoever, according to Counselor Harder. The mechanisms used here, according to the investigation, to move this money around in a way that it would not be subject to the taxes that would normally be prescribed by law include, number one, improper tax deductions, number two, the straight up undervaluation of real estate holdings by hundreds of millions of dollars. That what that quite simply means is that if you have a building worth, $20 million, just the numbers don't really matter. When you transfer that, you straight up claim that the value of that building is much smaller, which reduces the transfer tax liability and other taxes that may be associated depending on whether those property transfers are happening while the owner is alive or through their estate once they have passed away. The New York Times also writes, because this is, as soon as I read this, the scope and size of this investigation is so significant that any realistically credible investigative entity would absolutely be in touch with the people who are the subjects of the story, in this case Donald Trump and his family, to get comment from them. And indeed they have been. They've explained that for weeks as they've been working on this story, they tried to get statements from Trump about this. They told him they are working on this. And nothing other than this brief statement in which Charles Harder says, this was Trump's family, but Trump didn't actually do anything. It has nothing to do with Trump, period. It is important to point out, and this is where we get to, we have at least two justice systems, and we also have probably more than that in some way. Remember actor Wesley Snipes? Actor Wesley Snipes was sentenced to 3 years in prison because of tax charges that were a mere fraction of what is alleged here against Donald Trump and his family. That's what I was thinking as I read through this piece and read through the allegations that are made here. And the other thing that went through my mind is, if the New York Times was able to figure out this much stuff and in such detail about Donald Trump's family's financial dealings and potential criminality, Mueller must know way more than any of us are accounting for, right? And that is something that importantly signals that the claims that Trump was laundering Russian money, those claims are even more credible because it appears as though his entire family has been doing exactly those types of financial manipulations through real estate for decade upon decade. Think about that for a moment. If you read Trump's been laundering money for Russians for years, might be true, might be circumstantially supported by things we know about Donald Trump and what he and his sons have said. But we now have specific allegations from the New York Times, extraordinarily well-researched allegations, that the Trump family has made it not a habit but a sort of way of life to use real estate to move money around in ways that are evading what the law is surrounding that money. It is significantly more believable. It's almost obvious that, of course, Trump was doing money laundering for the Russians through real estate. He learned how to use real estate to move money around discreetly or surreptitiously from his own father, if this investigation is to be believed. So in the last 24 hours, consider what we've learned in the last 24 to, 36 hours. We've learned that Brett Kavanaugh, and we'll talk about this momentarily, tried to fix his alibi before Deborah Ramirez's allegations were made public via the New Yorker article and potentially tampered with witnesses. We learned that Donald Trump tried to get Stormy Daniels silenced in advance of that story going public. And now we are learning more and more about the really undeniable reality, as we've suspected for a long time, that Donald Trump's wealth likely came not just from that small loan of $1 million from his dad, but also from massive criminal level tax fraud, which we are only starting to learn about. One other just little note, it's very interesting to me that the way that this was supposedly being done, according to the New York Times, it involves sort of more nuanced and sophisticated accounting and tax stuff. And then it also involves just basic lying about how much buildings are worth, which is sort of exactly emblematic of how Donald Trump does things. He will lie and deceive in ways that are more sophisticated, and then he'll straight up lie to your face, which is exactly what you're doing when you say, my $50 million building? No, this isn't a good building. This thing's only worth $2 million. We will absolutely be following this, and again, there is now a new investigation by the New York State Tax Department, and we'll see what they ultimately come up with. Okay, so let's talk about Brett Kavanaugh a little bit. We have this hamstrung and limited FBI investigation into Donald Trump's Supreme Court nominee, Brett Kavanaugh. That continues. Brett Kavanaugh continues to prove why he is totally unfit to serve on the Supreme Court and realistically should be charged with perjury, and now we can add to that potentially witness tampering. If you've not been following this story, it is stunning. Brett Kavanaugh has been caught in yet another lie, this one actually bigger than some of the others, and Kavanaugh appears to have at least potentially tampered with a witness to the potential crimes that he committed. Witness tampering is a crime, and we're going to dig into that in a second. So let me set it up for you. You might remember that during the hearing last week with Brett Kavanaugh and his first of many sexual assault accusers, Christine Blasey Ford, Kavanaugh was asked under oath when was the first time that he heard about the allegations by Dr. Ford, and right after that he was asked when was the first time that he heard about the allegations made by Deborah Ramirez, who was a college classmate. Dr. Ford, a high school classmate, Deborah Ramirez, a college classmate. He was asked the question by Senator Orrin Hatch. Kavanaugh's answer seemed to be pretty clear. Let me remind you what that was.
When was the first time that the ranking member or her staff asked you about these allegations?
Today.
When did you first hear of Ms. Ramirez's allegations against you?
In the period since then, in the New Yorker story.
So the claim is very clear from Brett Kavanaugh. He first caught wind, the first time he ever heard that a woman named Deborah Ramirez was making the allegation that he, Kavanaugh, sexually assaulted her, was when he read it in the New Yorker piece by Ronan Farrow and Jane Mayer after Dr. Ford's allegations. Unfortunately, there is now direct and specific evidence to the contrary that suggests that not only did Brett Kavanaugh know about Deborah Ramirez's allegations against him well before he read about them in the New Yorker, he was actually proactively engaged in planning out how to refute her allegations. Carrie Burcham and Karen Yarosavage are both friends, or I guess we could say at least used to be friends or acquaintances of Brett Kavanaugh's. Burcham has come forward and said she has text messages detailing that Brett Kavanaugh was speaking with former Yale classmates. Remember, Christine Blasey Ford was a high school classmate. The Deborah Ramirez allegations, she's a Yale classmate. They relate to Kavanaugh's alleged actions when he was at Yale. That Brett Kavanaugh was talking to classmates, asking them to get involved, to go on record, refuting the allegations he knew stemmed from his former classmate, Deborah Ramirez, asking for people to contact Deborah Ramirez to try to influence what it is that she plans to say, all before September 23rd, which was the date of that New Yorker article about Deborah Ramirez. This is a direct and bold-faced lie. Unless time goes backwards, unless Brett Kavanaugh has a time machine, how can you be both working to refute claims of Deborah Ramirez and claim that you were not aware of those claims until you read about them in the New Yorker on September 23rd? So yet another apparent lie, and this one might also actually be criminal witness tampering. It's not clear. It's going to depend on the specifics and on the facts. It might be witness tampering, but in either case, it's completely inappropriate. And once again, if you are a nominee to the Supreme Court, you should not be contacting potential witnesses against you. We heard from Fordham law professor Jed Sugarman, who says that this is witness tampering. Others say it's not so clear, but this is not good for Brett Kavanaugh. And even worse is that Burcham, Carrie Burcham, the former friend and classmate of Brett Kavanaugh, she claims that the FBI isn't even getting back to her about this. She claims that she went to the FBI. She knows what's going on with Kavanaugh. She knows there's an investigation going on, albeit a very hamstrung one. She goes to the FBI and says, hey, Brett Kavanaugh said this during the hearing. I have text message evidence that that was a lie. Talk to me. And as of at least a few hours ago, she says that the FBI hasn't even followed up. A spokesman for Senator Chuck Grassley, who's running this entire circus of an investigation, of a confirmation hearing, claims that the text messages are a political ploy by Democrats. How are text messages that Brett Kavanaugh is party to a ploy by Democrats? Did Democrats trick Kavanaugh into text messaging people? It doesn't make any sense. And what we have ultimately here is significant hypocrisy. Imagine for a second if a Barack Obama Supreme Court pick had this going on. Republicans would be calling for prison time, never mind considering whether or not they should make a rush appointment for life to the highest court in the land. This is an issue on which Republicans and Democrats are simply different. On this program, when Republicans and Democrats are effectively the same, I tell you that. When Republicans and Democrats are different, I tell you that. Anthony Weiner was accused of sexual impropriety. He is totally gone from politics. I don't know of any Democrats that were defending what Anthony Weiner did. Al Franken, former Minnesota senator. Franken did like 1% of what Brett Kavanaugh is accused of here. He resigned within days with Democrats saying that he should resign. Meanwhile, allegation after lie, after distortion, after allegation from Brett Kavanaugh. And what do Republicans do? They simply continue trying to push through his nomination even more quickly. The similarities between that and the relationship of the Republican Party to Kavanaugh and how it compares to Trump, very, very similar, unhinged, both erratic, both liars, both tampering with witnesses, both accused of serial sexual assault. Maybe that's why Trump is standing behind Brett Kavanaugh, but I actually think that there's more to it. I think we actually are increasingly figuring out what the real story is about why Trump will not abandon Brett Kavanaugh. I'm going to talk to you about that after the break. Send me your thoughts. I'm on Twitter at dpacman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show, and boy, do we have a good one for you today.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Catherine Bursett. Catherine, thank you for being a David Pakman Show member. This is a mostly viewer and listener supported program, which is why it's so important for me to thank people that are making the show possible and allowing us to continue to grow and do new and exciting things. And in addition to Catherine, we also have Audrey Bao, who is today's sustaining longtime member of the day. She's been a member dating all the way back to July of 2013. More than 5 years, going on 6 for Audrey. Catherine, Audrey, thanks to both of you. Join them as members, get all the great member benefits, including the bonus show, the commercial-free audio feed, the commercial-free video feed, and I think most importantly, beyond the actual perks, is just the knowledge that you're part of the solution to the media monopoly that we have in the United States, rather than part of the problem by being a David Pakman Show member. www.joinpakman.com, 40% coupon code VOTESOON18, good through the day of the midterm elections, and then it is gone forever. Save 40% if you want at joinpakman.com. Okay, it is time for Hatriot Mail. If you've never heard Hatriot Mail before, Hatriot Mail is I get a ton of hate mail, and we have a deep voice movie announcer who does interpretive readings of that hate mail. Sometimes they are homophobic, sometimes they are anti-Semitic. They are always unhinged. Quick reminder about what Hatriot Mail is.
If Ayn Rand and Ronald Reagan had a baby and suckled that child off the teat of liberty, its cries would sound a little something like Hatriot Mail. Written by patriots who hate David Pakman. Because America. And because freedom.
So this week's Hatriot Mail, like most, requires no introduction, but it is timely. It relates to sexual assault allegations and Brett Kavanaugh, and this is actually something I've been experiencing a lot on Twitter. I'll tell you about it after we listen to this week's Hatriot Mail.
Pakman is a shill. LMAO. David Pakman equals shill, liar, media whore. Pakman, a privileged Jew, racist. Worse bullshit on YouTube. David Pakman touched my penis and tried to rape me last summer. Him so ashamed, but he must pay. I would love to get a group together to publicly accuse Pakman of gay rape. He pregagnated me. How do you like that, eh? Lol.
Yeah, I can assure you that I've never pregagnated anybody, but this is actually something that I've been dealing with on Twitter for the last few days, which is, given my position on the allegations against Brett Kavanaugh, which I find generally credible, and I generally find him to not be credible, a bunch of people on Twitter have started saying, well, David, we're going to accuse you of rape, and then you'll see what it's like. To which I've been saying, go ahead and try. I can assure you that if you try to do it, those allegations will get absolutely no traction, because they would be so obviously false. And there's this idea that any rape allegation, any sexual assault allegation, no matter how incredible, becomes accepted as some kind of fact immediately. That's simply not true. Obviously, bogus allegations wouldn't go anywhere, which is why I said, go ahead and try to accuse me of some kind of sexual assault. You're going to get nowhere. You're going to get nowhere because it will be obviously not credible. What you can do if you don't like these Hatriots, if you don't like this point of view that they're espousing, the coupon code Hatriot40, if you use it on any membership on our website, www.joinpakman.com, you'll save 40%, and 166 Hatriots will cry every time you use that 40% discount code. Okay, I want to talk about a sort of bigger picture story that relates to Brett Brett Kavanaugh, but is actually sort of about Donald Trump and the Trump-Russia investigation. And you might hear that and say, I don't really understand how those things go together, and I'll explain to you how they go together. Every single time that there is another allegation against Brett Kavanaugh from a sexual assault accuser, or every time that another Kavanaugh classmate says he lied under oath about this or he lied under oath about that, every time we figure out something else that Kavanaugh just hasn't been upfront about, right? You hear from more and more Republican senators who say, I really need to think about whether this is somebody that I can support. I immediately wonder, why doesn't Trump just pick somebody else? And the reality is that at any time, Donald Trump could call up Brett Kavanaugh and say, listen, I need you to step aside. It's become a circus. Let me pick somebody else who isn't going to have these issues, because if it's not Kavanaugh, Trump can get somebody else confirmed, right? That it's not really an issue of whether Trump can get anyone confirmed. It's a question of whether Kavanaugh can get confirmed. But Trump hasn't done that. Trump has continued to say, or at least allow, the potential confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh to go forward. I've up until now basically been of the mindset that the reason Trump is continuing with Kavanaugh is Trump's personality. Trump doesn't want to be seen as losing. He would see it as a win to get Brett Kavanaugh on the court, and he would see it as a loss if for whatever reason he ended up having to pick somebody else, even though either way you're going to end up with a conservative Supreme Court justice on the court. So increasingly I've started to think it has to be more than just that. It can't just be that Trump simply wants to win with Kavanaugh, because this is taking a long time. A lot of political capital is being expended here. What else could it be? And there's an entire other storyline that could explain Trump's desire for it to be not just any conservative justice, to a judge to be put on the Supreme Court as a justice, but specifically Kavanaugh, and it relates to Trump and Russia and Robert Mueller's investigation. And that's what I want to explain to you today and see what you think about it. If you are a president who's being investigated for possible very serious crimes that you've committed, potentially, by a special prosecutor, Brett Kavanaugh is exactly the type of guy that you would want as the ninth vote on the Supreme Court. Why? Well, Kavanaugh has argued not only that you can't indict a sitting president, there are actually a number of legal experts who agree with that, but that presidents shouldn't even have to face criminal prosecution or criminal investigations while they are presidents, and that presidents don't even have to follow laws that they deem to be unconstitutional. There's a major piece of case law around investigating presidents, which is U.S. v. Nixon from 1974. In the past, Kavanaugh has questioned the correctness of that decision many times. On the question of whether a sitting president can even be subpoenaed to answer questions, again, that's something Trump is dealing with right now. The point of view of someone who disagrees with U.S. v. Nixon is very clear. If you think the 1974 Nixon case was decided incorrectly, as Kavanaugh has stated, you're probably going to rule, if it came before the Supreme Court, that Donald Trump cannot be subpoenaed to testify as part of this investigation. If Trump ultimately wants to fire Robert Mueller, and that decision were to end up before the Supreme Court, if you're a judge or justice like Kavanaugh, and you think that the 1974 Nixon case was decided incorrectly, you probably rule in defending Donald Trump's firing of Robert Mueller if it were to take place. Now, defenders of Kavanaugh and Trump will write into me and they'll say, well, yeah, he has been critical of that 1974 decision, but at other points Kavanaugh has also said that he thinks the decision was made correctly. I think without a doubt the most recent and relevant statements that Kavanaugh has made about that decision are that he doesn't think it was the right decision. When during his confirmation hearings, Kavanaugh was asked by Senator Kamala Harris whether he had conversations about the Trump-Russia investigation with anybody at the law firm of Mark Kasowitz, who had been representing Donald Trump in that investigation, he gave non-answers. That's another reason Trump may want Kavanaugh specifically, because Kavanaugh may already have been involved in discussions about the Trump-Russia Mueller investigation. And one can even argue, actually, that Kavanaugh's lying and unhinged, sort of erratic, out-of-control demeanor during last week's hearings might also be part of why Donald Trump wants him on the court, sort of an audition for it. Trump wants Kavanaugh on the court because, quite frankly, he wants an angry, erratic, dogmatically loyal guy who believes in almost totally unfettered presidential power, and he wants that person on the court as soon as humanly possible so that Trump can get back to interfering with and getting in the way of Robert Mueller's investigation. This means it's not only incredibly important to block Kavanaugh, but we've got to take over as many seats as possible in November, in those November midterms, which are now just over 4 weeks away, because not only is this a play to influence the judiciary of the United States for decades, Kavanaugh in his early 50s, it's a direct play to continue interfering with the Trump-Russia investigation, which we know has been one of Donald Trump's top priorities for a very long time at this point. Send me your thoughts. Could this be why Trump is sticking with Kavanaugh when pretty clearly at this point it would probably be easier just to get somebody else confirmed? Make sure you follow The David Pakman Show on Instagram at David Pakman Show. Follow me on Instagram as well at david.pakman, behind-the-scenes pictures of my temporary studio for the week and much more. Quick break. I will interview economist Steve Keen coming up next.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to be joined today by Steve Keen, who is an economist, professor at Kingston University London, also author of several books, including Debunking Economics, and most recently, Can We Avoid Another Financial Crisis?, now crowdfunded on Patreon at patreon.com/PROF, like Professor Steve Keen, K-E-E-N. Steve, great to talk to you. Thank you for being with us.
Delighted to be asked.
So this topic of realistic economics has been really interesting to me for a long time, and I think it's a really important issue in general because it affects so much policy that our elected officials are talking about all the time. So maybe like at the top level, just to get our audience into the idea of what you're discussing here, what is not realistic about how economics is mostly taught at the college level?
Well, the answer to that is almost virtually everything. But I think I should start from a wonderful quip from that brilliant American satirist I mentioned many, many decades ago, when he said that to every human problem, there is a solution which is neat, plausible, and wrong. And that's the situation with economic theory. It looks neat, it looks plausible, but when you dig into the foundations, it's actually wrong. So, for example, I'll take the simplest example. This is the one that I start my lectures with for my students at Kingston, and that is the idea of the supply curve. Now, the idea of the supply curve, you do the classic drawing that every economics textbook has, and I think it inhabits the mind of economists at a very deep level, is the idea of intersecting supply and demand curves. A supply curve that slopes up because the people think that just makes sense. So if you want to buy something more or something that's going to cost more, so that's what people think at the plausible level. But when you look at what they're actually arguing, they're saying, well, the reason price rises is because the productivity of your variable input, which is labor fundamentally, falls as you produce more output. So you have an increasing level of output. You're paying the same wage per worker, but each worker is producing slightly less than the one before. Therefore, your cost per unit rises. That's why you have a rising supply curve. It is empirical nonsense. It has been torn apart by something like about 40 or so surveys. The last one being done by Alan Blinder, who when he did it was the vice president of the American Economic Association. So I'm not talking raving radicals here. And what he found was that when you asked firms what their cost structure were, they had constant or falling marginal cost. They didn't have diminishing marginal productivity at all. And the reason is quite simple. Thankfully, economists do not design factories, engineers do. And they build them so that as they approach capacity, they become more efficient. They reach maximum capacity when the factory is at full usage stage. You normally build a factory and start it with about, say, 70% capacity because you're expecting growth over time. And as you approach that peak level of performance, your costs actually fall.
So let me see if I can, just because our audience may not be, let's see if we can just rephrase so we can make sure we're all on the same page here.
I could feel that, yeah.
So
I'll start again.
There's this idea that in basic economics, that as you supply more of a widget, for example, that the cost to supply that widget is going to go up. But that in practice, what actually seems to be the case is that you are able to reduce the cost per widget as you produce more because of efficiencies that exist within manufacturing, to take the factory example. Is that more or less what you're saying?
Yes, the factory is a production line. You design it to work best when the factory is going gangbusters. You build the factory with a spare capacity. As you approach gangbusters scale, your costs actually fall. So rather than a rising supply curve, if anything, it should be a horizontal or falling supply curve. Now, once you do that, the entire theory of economics starts to unravel. And that applies to so many points in the theory that it's almost beyond cataloging them all.
Let's talk a little bit about the sort of rational actor theories of economics. I've spoken extensively about the work of behavioral economists, including folks like Daniel Kahneman and so many others. And there are so many different data points that we increasingly have, which tell us that the idea of sort of standard economics, that every participant in an economic system is always acting completely rationally on the basis of the information that's available, is simply not true. But yet the idea still continues to persist. What is your assessment of the best way to understand why the rational actor hypothesis simply is not realistic?
Well, the simplest reason is because the way they define rational, if you actually took out left the word out and gave the definition that they give of what rational behavior is, what it comes down to is people have a model in their heads which is able to accurately predict the future. Now, if you told somebody, here's a definition, what's the word that goes with it? They wouldn't choose rational, they'd choose the word prophetic.
Or psychic, so what they actually you could even say.
What they actually call rational behavior is prophetic behavior. Now, I'm sorry, I'm not rational because I don't have prophecy as one of my skills. And I had it's the reason they've actually got this concept is because they would have liked the market to dominate, even if you had irrational behavior. They would have liked that outcome. But when they did all their various bits and pieces of modeling, the market would not reach equilibrium. It wouldn't reach the ideal point. So they pretended that we could actually predict what that ideal point should be and move to it anyway. So effectively, their idea of rational agents is saying the whole universe is inhabited by gods who can predict the future accurately, in which case, what do they need a market for? So it's actually a failure of the theory, but it's disguised by the use of language.
Is there a case to be made, and I ask this sincerely, not in a rhetorical way or with any kind of preconceived notion, is there a case to be made that despite all of the failings and inaccuracies that we now know exist with the sort of traditional schools of economic thought, that there is still some logic to starting with that, because it does create a framework which we could then explain the failings of, where if I think back to microeconomics 101 and macroeconomics 102 in college, I now understand why what was presented there does not make sense. But I'm curious as to whether if I had jumped right into behavioral economics and some of the other things that you and I are talking about and are going to talk about, I would have lacked the foundation to then understand why it doesn't make sense, if my question's clear.
Well, you understand why the theory doesn't make sense, but I think what it actually does is it distracts you from what's actually interesting about capitalism. Because what it's fundamentally telling you is that capitalism is a system that reaches equilibrium, and we make a few little assumptions like all goods, like all cars are the same, and all TV shows are the same, and so on, homogenizing this to make it easy to understand. In fact, what's special about capitalism is not equilibrium at all. It's far from equilibrium behavior, pushing you to innovate. And consequently, the theory itself distracts you from what's not just what's bad about capitalism, what's good about it. And I would rather say, let's start all over again and begin with an evolutionary framework and say what we see in capitalism is an evolutionary system. And compared to previous social systems like feudalism and socialism for that matter, there's far more innovation, far more evolutionary change in capitalism. And that's a good thing. And then we could start from that perspective and get a very, very different view of the world, which would be more accurate.
So in other words, if I hear you correctly, you're saying that the way economics is taught gets both the failings and successes of capitalism wrong.
Yeah, you don't get any explanation, for example, in a conventional economic theory of why growth occurs. You simply say there is an improvement in technology over time. Now, I would like to understand, why does technology improve? What are the factors behind it? And if you read Schumpeter, for example, who's very much a non-neoclassical economist, he gives a wonderful explanation of why capitalists innovate and why that sort of level of innovation didn't occur in a feudal system. And another non-orthodox economist called János Kornai, who was Hungarian and trying to understand why socialist economies grew so slowly, developed a concept of what he called demand-constrained versus resource-constrained economies, saying that socialists are resource-constrained and therefore you try to make last year's product in a larger scale, whereas capitalist ones are demand constrained, and to grab hold of that demand, you need to innovate more than your competitor does. That's a much richer appreciation of capitalism than what you get out of neoclassical theory.
What are the political implications of these fundamental misunderstandings of economics and how it's taught? And if you want to get into specific policy that is sort of put on the back of bad economics, that I think that would be interesting, whether it's tax policy, understandings of debt and deficit, austerity measures, whatever. Like, how does the foundational problem of how economics is taught lead to elected officials making bad policy?
I think the best area is the financial system, because that's not one that you don't actually raise your left versus right political feelings about it. It's obvious the financial system failed in 2008. Why did economists not see that it was going to fail? Because they convinced themselves they could model capitalism while leaving the financial sector completely out of their equations. So they weren't even looking at what caused the financial crisis. At the same time, they were advising politicians that it was a really good idea to deregulate banks, to expand their operations, and don't worry about the level of private debt, that's irrelevant. Now, that's completely disastrously wrong advice. It's like telling a captain of the Titanic, don't worry about icebergs, the nice fluffy things that can't hurt you.
So can you go into more depth about that? I mean, when we think back to the 2008 financial crisis, there are sort of not necessarily competing explanations for it, but certainly differing explanations in terms of the importance of any one factor, whether it's deregulation, mortgage crisis, cyclical downturn, et cetera. Is it even possible to start to unpack what is actually the initial catalyst for such a downturn?
Absolutely. And I've spent 30 years doing this, and there's plenty of my successors and co-workers have done the same thing. It was credit. We had too much private credit. And the simple dynamics is that credit, which is borrowing money from banks, adds to the money supply and adds to the amount of demand in existence. But of course, it also adds to the amount of debt. So as you rely more and more upon credit, the level of private debt rises. You reach a point where that private debt can't be serviced because many of the ventures financed have been Ponzi schemes that have failed, or badly thought out ventures to begin with. The level of credit drops, and when it drops, you go from credit boosting demand to credit actually subtracting from demand. Now, that's why I started warning about the crisis myself in 2005, the end of 2005. And Wynne Godley beat me by about 6 years. Ann Pettifor beat me by a couple of years. Plenty of people who look at the level of debt, private debt, and say that the credit causes demand, and when it stops growing, there'll be a crisis. We were the ones who warned about the crisis and were ignored because we weren't part of the mainstream. So it's extremely easy to unpack what caused the crisis. And when you do, you come up with policies that say you shouldn't deregulate banks. You should actually be controlling the money creation powers they have.
I think that that's a great place to pause, and exactly where I want to pick up the conversation in part two, which relates to not only private debt, but even at the national level, discussions about debt and deficit and where they go wrong. We're speaking with economist Steve Keen. He has written a number of books, including Debunking Economics, and most recently, Can We Avoid Another Financial Crisis? And we'll continue our conversation with him in part two.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Let's talk about trade. Donald Trump has been making massive claims about what he says is this heroic replacement to NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, called USMCA. He did a big press conference. There was a huge hubbub around it. Right-wing media got very, very involved in touting it as just this incredibly masterful thing that Donald Trump has pulled off. And Donald Trump has been calling it a brand new deal. And he's saying that on the basis of this, quote, brand new deal, he has delivered on the campaign promise of getting rid of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Fox News made a huge deal about this, saying that Trump putting in place the USMCA is revolutionizing global trade. So let's go kind of back to the beginning on this, right? This entire NAFTA trade thing started because during the campaign, Trump started making claims about the U.S. being treated unfairly when it comes to trade. It was clear he didn't really know much about trade, and it was even more clear that the people in his base who fell for his expertise on trade also didn't know much about it. And Trump ended up successfully bamboozling his followers into thinking Trump knows about trade, Trump's going to fix trade, we've got to get rid of NAFTA, Trump calling NAFTA the worst trade deal ever. And it worked. People voted for Trump. And they believed that he would fix the issue that he explained exists. And now we have a situation where Trumpists have become sort of unilaterally and completely opposed to NAFTA at a base level. Now, I'll be the first to admit, I have no interest in sugarcoating the idea that NAFTA has major, major problems. It's a trade agreement involving the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. It has issues. It's just not as bad as Trump said, and more importantly, solving the problems that NAFTA has isn't as easy to do if you want to avoid creating new problems in that process. And that's sort of the big con here, which is that Donald Trump is now claiming not only that he has fixed the issues of NAFTA, but that he has replaced NAFTA with the USMCA. That's the big con. The USMCA is basically NAFTA with some modifications. It's like NAFTA 2.0, NAFTA Light, call it whatever you want. And some of the modifications are important. Again, I want these issues to be resolved, and I have no interest in merely saying everything Trump does is bad. Some of the modifications that Trump was able to do are significant, but they're not revolutionary, and it's certainly nothing close to actually getting rid of NAFTA. It's coming up with a slightly modified version of NAFTA and giving it a different name, which brands it differently, which is often what actually achieves political success, which is just the branding of the things that you do. So let's talk about it. What does the USMCA actually do? The biggest change is labor provisions, okay? One of the provisions in USMCA is that by 2023, 40 to 45% of automobile content, meaning the stuff that makes up the finished car, must be made by workers earning at least $16 an hour. This specifically targets Mexico. In the United States, working in the auto manufacturing field for $16 an hour is not that much of a stretch. In Mexico, it is more of a stretch because wages are lower. So the idea of mandating that by 2023, 40 to 45% of automobile content must be made by workers earning $16 an hour, the idea is, number one, shrink the gap, the wage gap between the U.S. and Mexico, so that you will make it less appealing to move production to Mexico, and if you're lucky, create more employment opportunities in the United States. Now, it happens to go directly against free trade. It's a form of restricting the movement of labor, but we're used to that hypocrisy by now, so no real surprise there. Another provision from the USMCA, cars and trucks must have 75% of components manufactured in Mexico, the US, or Canada, in order to qualify for no tariffs. Previously, that was 62.5% of components. Is that massively life-altering the way Donald Trump is claiming? Is it fair to say that NAFTA is gone and we have something totally different, when all you've really done is say, well, instead of 62.5% of components, it's 75% of components? I think that most reasonable people would understand that that's a pretty big stretch when it comes to saying that NAFTA's gone and something completely different is here. The idea is get manufacturers to buy parts from our 3 countries in the deal instead of Asia. That's fine. But going from 62.5% to 75% is not exactly a blockbuster deal that bears no resemblance to the previous one that Trump said is the worst deal ever. In other words, if NAFTA was the worst deal ever, with 62.5% of automobile components needing to be required, be manufactured in these 3 countries to avoid tariffs, does making it 75% now make it a good deal, or is it just a slight change from what we had before? The USMCA also adds some provisions for the party countries to be able to sanction each other for violations of the agreement. NAFTA didn't have that, so that is a difference. The problem is, if you think back to TPP, one of the real horrible things about TPP was that it created this sort of transnational extrajudicial way of doing arbitration when there are disagreements or misdeeds by countries at the country level. The way that the USMCA would allow countries that are party to the deal to sanction each other is very similar. It's one of these transnational sort of multi-step processes. Is that a good thing? It certainly wasn't good when it was part of TPP. So yet again, another one of these hypocrisies. And then lastly, there's the dairy industry. Trump has been talking a lot about the dairy issue for a while. Canada, as part of the USMCA, is agreeing to tweak its dairy market. It's going to get rid of something called Class 7 milk, which made it cheaper to buy certain kinds of high-protein milk products from Canada. U.S. farmers didn't like it. They wanted to sell their high-protein milk to Canada. This will help some farmers in the United States, but it's a very small number. It matters to them. I'm not saying it isn't important to them, but macroeconomically, it is almost completely insignificant. And the idea that, again, that makes this a drastically different deal than NAFTA is pretty laughable. And then lastly, intellectual property. Copyright is going to be extended from 50 years beyond the life of the author to 70 years beyond the life of the author, including more protections for some drugs from generic competition. I don't know if that's good. I mean, there are problems in the world of copyright, but a lot of those problems are that copyright is too strong rather than too weak. So the idea that you're going to solve problems by making copyright even more strict, big picture in the net, is very hard to believe for me. So overall, this is being touted as this just massive, life-changing alteration to the status quo of NAFTA. It's a tweak. It's a tweak, and Trump is going to push it as a major success, and more than likely he will have some success pushing it in that way. It's not the reality on the ground. We have had this segment on the Friday show for the David Pakman Show called Audience Questions for years. We actually started doing audience questions before we had the technology to take live calls. So now we take live calls and hear from people about what's on their mind. Before we could take live calls, we used to collect questions from the audience during the week and then answer 3 of those questions on Friday. We now have live calls, and increasingly I have started to feel that they are sort of redundant segments. If we're taking live calls and hearing from the audience and hearing about what's on people's minds, do we then also need to do 3 additional audience questions, which are basically just a different format of live call? So what I'm proposing to you today, and I want your help with this, is that I'm looking at retiring audience questions as a standalone segment because we've got live calls, and replacing audience questions with something else. My question to you is, what do we replace audience questions with? I have a few ideas, but I want to hear from you about what you would like us to do. Number 1, Right now, we alternate between doing a classic interview from the archives that's relevant today with a new commentary that I do when we rerun the interview. We alternate that with doing a few extra live calls every other week. So one thing we could do is we could get rid of audience questions. We could continue doing the live calls, but we could do a classic interview every week. So instead of getting a classic interview only every other week, you get a classic interview every week. We have more than enough interviews in the archives, and it would be no problem to do that. That's one possibility. Another possibility is to replace live calls with international news, a sort of international news wrap-up of the week. These tend not to do super well. The people who like the international news segments really like them, but overall, I don't know how appealing it is to the majority of our audience. That doesn't mean we can't do it. We could do segments that appeal to, a niche of the audience. That's fine. Science and technology, doing something science and technology related every week in place of audience questions. That's a possibility. But these are only like 3 ideas. So what I'm asking you to think about, and get in touch with me, david@davidpakman.com, if you have strong feelings. What else might you like to see taking the place of audience questions? The top suggestions that we get, we will turn into a poll, open it up to the entire audience, and then you will ultimately decide what's going to replace audience questions. Get in touch. I'm open to all ideas. There's no such thing as a bad idea. There are ideas that the audience might not enjoy and might not be feasible for us to produce, but I want to hear anything that comes to mind. What segment is missing from the David Pakman Show that you would like to see added? Because this is one of those opportunities where we change the format of the show, and I want to hear from you. David@davidpakman.com. What should we replace audience questions with? We have a voicemail number. That number is 219-2DavidP. Let's take a listen to the a voicemail that came in early this morning.
Hi, David. I just wanted to know what your thoughts on Tinder is. So like, if you believe if it's a good thing or a bad thing, whether or not it helps students or hurts them. Yeah, just wanted to know your opinion on it. Thank you.
I don't think that Tinder, which is a dating app, is objectively good or bad. You always will hear people who take very black and white positions, like, for example, meeting over the internet is simply not as good as meeting people in person for this reason or for that reason. I don't buy into that. I think Tinder is absolutely fine. I think one of the bigger upsides of Tinder is that it does allow for people who might get very anxious or uncomfortable in sort of initial conversations with somebody you've just met to interact with them via writing, via text, before you actually meet them in person. And I think that might make it so that people who otherwise wouldn't really be meeting anybody can meet people. I think that the sort of downside is that when you do the sort of window shopping thing and you're making a split-second decision, mostly based on someone's appearance about whether you're interested in getting to know them, there are probably good connections and good relationships that never happen because you're swiping no rather than yes. But big picture, I don't think that there's any big societal risk to Tinder. I'm not on it myself. But I'm not an anti-Tinder person whatsoever. If you have like a good, strong anti-Tinder case to make, then get in touch and let me know. We've got a great bonus show for you today. Access the bonus show by being a member. Sign up at www.joinpakman.com or by becoming a patron for at least $5 a month at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. I will speak to you on the bonus show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.